Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you everyone for joining, those of you online as well. My name is Iman Zarrouk, and I am here representing the Libya INGO Forum. The Libya INGO Forum is a network of 30 INGOs who work across humanitarian development and peace building programming all across Libya. Joining me is Jacqueline, who will introduce herself and then walk us through the agenda for the next hour. Jacqueline, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I apologize for not being there in person, so I'm here remotely, joining in the session with my dear colleague. My name is Jacqueline Foster. I'm the Executive Director for the NGO Coordinating Committee for Iraq. We have over 240 partners with our organization, and it's about a 50-50 split between national NGOs and foreign NGOs. NCCI is a Swiss-based organization, which is where our HQ is located. So with that brief introduction, again, thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to a good, robust conversation and discussion. So the agenda today is that Imam and I are going to give you a brief context overview of our respective countries. We will delve into a little bit about what is meant by nexus. And then we will talk about the transition processes in Iraq and Libya from an NGO perspective. Deactivation guidelines from sectors or clusters, the nomenclature is a little bit different between Iraq and Libya. We will also discuss the deactivation process, some discussions on needs and narratives, and some nuanced data. And then we will come back to you with some conclusions, some lessons learned, and some recommendations based on what has occurred in our respective context. So with that, I am going to jump into a little bit of an overview about Iraq. And not that I'm here to give you a history lesson, but for me, in order to understand the complex nature of operating in Iraq, you have to understand a little bit of where it has come from. Because the background in Iraq at the present day and what takes place and the decisions that government make or the decisions that government does not make is often found rooted in a little bit of history. So essentially Iraq in the last 20 years can be broken down into like 4 stages. The first one is from 2003 to 2007, and that was kicked off by the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. The US-led Coalition Provisional Authority was established as the governing body, and the US had embedded advisors within each key ministry. During this transition phase, what was taking place was there was building of new political parties. There was training of military forces following the de-Baathification process, creating a civil society because one really did not exist in Iraq prior to that time. So that was when the original legislation was being drafted. And then also a multitude of other laws were being prepared and instituted. In 2005, a new constitution was put into place in Iraq. And essentially what that new constitution did is somewhat at the crux of some of the challenges in Iraq that we see today. There was a shift in political balance of power in Iraq as a result of that constitution. Prior to that constitution, the minority Sunnis were in charge of government and essential services. Once that constitution was put into place, the power of balance shifted, and now the majority Shia were in power. Also, for the first time with that new constitution, that there was a Kurdish president, and there was also a recognition of the Kurdistan region as having autonomous powers. The power balance shift also led to an outbreak of sectarian tensions and violence throughout Iraq. And at the same time is when the very beginning stages of the group, which is now known as ISIS, started as a result of these power imbalances in Iraq. The second stage in Iraq is between 2007 and 2011, and this was predominantly marked by the surge of US troops to help stem the sectarian violence that was taking place throughout Iraq. The Sunni tribes initiated what is known as the awakening, and this is whereby many of the Sunni tribes agreed to work with the US military as opposed to fighting against it. And then finally in 2011, US troops withdrew from Iraq with the agreement and understanding with the Baghdad government that they would incorporate the Sunni tribes into Iraqi security forces. And because these are the security forces that help to contain the bloodshed through this awakening movement in Iraq. The third stage is from 2012 to 2017. And at this time, the government of Iraq failed to honor its commitment to the Sunni tribes, in that they did not incorporate the Sunni tribes or members of the Sunni community into the security forces. And those that were a part of the apparatus were not being paid. Also, during this time, tens of thousands of Sunnis were arrested and jailed and detained by the government. Thousands and thousands of Sunnis then started protesting throughout Iraq, and then accused the then Prime Minister Maliki of exclusionary policies. Also during this time, this is the kind of the most critical point that leads us to where we are today in Iraq, in that in 2013, the Islamic State of Iraq started to expand into Syria. And at this time is when Baghdadi declared himself as the Caliph of the Islamic State based in Mosul, and that is now the beginning of ISIS. During this time is when ISIS started to capture large parts of Iraq, and leading to the tremendous amount of humanitarian need, and that occurred during this time. The rise of ISIS also further split Iraqi society, in which a highly respected religious leader issued a fatwa requesting that all Iraqis raise arms against ISIS. In 2014, the government of Iraq requested the humanitarian assistance that has been in place since that time. Eventually, with foreign assistance, there was a declaration of the end of the ISIS control in 2017. However, at that time, that there was an estimated 11 million IDPs in Iraq. That number has now reduced to approximately 2.5 million in 2022, according to OCHA records. And then finally, the fourth stage of the Iraq context started pretty much in 2018. There were elections that were held. There were supposed to be elections in 2022. However, due to protesting that took place in 2019 through 2021, snap elections were called. And from 2021 through 2022, essentially, there was only a caretaker government, as a formalized government could not be put into place. So with that, it's a little bit of the background of Iraq. So I am now going to turn it back over to my colleague for a Libya background.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and welcome, and thank you to those who've just recently joined us. So those who are not as intimately familiar with Libya, I'll do a quick, super quick overview. Basically, it's been 12 years since the Arab Spring swept through Libya, toppling decades-long dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi. The country remains today mired in political instability, conflict, social and tribal divisions, economic decline, two competing governments, foreign and regional influence, and what a multi-stakeholder roundtable in December of last year deemed a protection crisis. There was a ceasefire in 2020. It did see large-scale conflict come to a stop. However, the political roadmap that aimed to see elections at the end of 2021 did not transpire as many hoped and expected. Since then, a rival government has emerged in the eastern part of the country, arguing that the other's mandate has come to an end and a political stalemate continues today. One in the oil-rich east of the country, and one in the western capital of Tripoli. Against this backdrop, proliferation of armed groups and militias has continued over the years, each holding various levels of power throughout the country, their political loyalty shifting depending on mandates, legitimacy, and funding. Localized tensions continue to threaten the larger stability of various parts, with the last taking place in August, in which over 100 people were killed, and that's August of last year. Libya's humanitarian response plan ended at the end of last year, so 2022, after a second extension mid-year to be replaced by a development cooperation program, hoped to be channeled via or in partnership with the government. The decision was largely based on the decrease in the number of people requiring humanitarian assistance, which is an estimated 300,000 people this year. The decision was largely based, it's important to note that there was no humanitarian needs overview this year. Instead, it was replaced by a humanitarian overview that uses a vastly different methodology. Despite the estimated decrease in the number of people in need, recent MSNA data shows that the severity and intensity of existing needs remains high, especially among protection needs of migrants, refugees, and IDPs. Similar reductions have also been reported for the numbers of internally displaced, or IDPs, down 40% in 2022. With that, there has also been a dramatic increase in the number of returnees, for which there is absolutely no formal support by the government or governments. For those facing displacement, destruction of homes and property continues to be a driving marker, as does endemic discrimination against certain groups that prevents many IDPs from returning home. Denial of legal status or documentation prevents many from accessing basic services and puts them at increased risk. Libya remains both a transit and destination point for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Their status remains a serious case for concern. It's estimated that over 600,000 migrants are living in Libya at the moment, with the total population of the country's approximately 8 million. 41,000 of them are registered with UNHCR. Authorities in country reject the concept of asylum, and as such, they are considered de facto illegal. They seldom, if ever, are able to access basic services, let alone durable solutions. Just switch the slide. Because of the extremely complex access constraints in country, these figures are a minimum and may not reflect the actual realities on the ground. Those who attempt to cross the most dangerous Mediterranean route risk pushback by very deliberate externalization policies and are returned to Libya, where they risk facing detention in abhorrent conditions, extortion, trafficking, harassment, abuse, that includes sexual and gender-based violence, and exploitation. The Global Protection Cluster in a recent analysis listed the most severe as denial of resources, opportunities, and services, unlawful impediments and movement restrictions, inhumane treatment in detention centers, evictions, destruction of property, and human trafficking across very sophisticated global networks. Official or minimum estimates indicate that 6,000 migrants and refugees remain in official government-run detention centers across Libya. Thousands more believed to be held in unofficial sites. 35% of migrant and refugee children are unaccompanied. They live in urban settings, and they're disproportionately exposed to risks of child labor, among a slew of other things. The number of them held in detention centers increased from 200 in 2020 to over 700 in 2022. Again, very complex access restraints in country make it difficult to assess real figures. Libya continues to be considered unsafe for return following a pushback at sea, according to HCR, UNHCR, and IOM. The recent report of the Independent Fact-Finding Mission on Libya found countless in-country violations to be crimes against humanity, amongst areas where access was actually permitted. The report makes very clear that requests to visit some sites like prisons and detention centers went unanswered. A multi-stakeholder roundtable convened late last year, in approximately end of November, December of last year, that included UN agencies, donors, and INGOs, officially deemed it a protection crisis. So before we talk about transition and how both of these contexts kind of went through the transition process, we thought to do a bit of an intro on what is Nexus. So what is the Nexus, this thing that we talk so much about? The Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus gained global momentum in 2016, as many of us know, at the World Humanitarian Summit, where the global community committed to a new way of working. It sought to put an end to the siloed ways of working in exchange for increased coherency, coordination, and collaboration among all three pillars and across response actors. At the summit, the UN Secretary General then outlined an ambition to work towards achieving collective outcomes that reduce need, risk, and vulnerability over multiple years based on the comparative advantage of a diverse range of actors. The new way of working is now an acknowledged commitment of the global community, where to reduce impacts of crises, we need to simultaneously meet immediate needs and invest in the medium to long term, ensuring integrated multi-sectoral assistance that address wider economic and governance systems. More, IASC, or as we know, the Interagency Standing Committee's policy guidance, recognizes that the old way was not working and business as usual is not delivering the results needed. The policy direction is clear and well established. Behaviors, attitudes, and work processes must change to make the new way of working the established norm. Since then, various policy frameworks have emerged. A lot has been written on the topic, except little by way of actual precedent. Putting this into broader perspective, according to the OECD, 24% of the world's population live in fragile countries characterized by protracted crisis, conflict, displacement, poor governance, and difficulty to mitigate and absorb risk. They warn, the OECD, that the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals is actually off track in many, and development and peace-building actors have struggled to stay and deliver. Switch. This year is especially relevant as it marks the midway point of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Despite that, progress in achieving those SDGs has either stagnated or declined on 11 of 15 of the Sustainable Development Goals in more than half of fragile contexts. According to the OECD, also, blind spots, including policy and operational missteps, reflect a failure to communicate across development and peace channels so far. The average humanitarian crisis lasts approximately 9 years and has led humanitarian funding to exceed $40 billion US dollars for the first time in 2022. That number is up to a record $51.5 billion this year. In the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, resource allocation for humanitarian plans lasts 7 years on average, and allocation has increased 400% in the recent past. What does this tell us? For Libya and Iraq, where transitions to development frameworks are well underway, this warning presents an opportunity to ensure that we're taking the existing guidance, the existing policy frameworks, and adjusting them to country context as closely as possible. For Libya, which I'll get into a little more shortly, it should be one that meaningfully and responsibly puts the centrality of protection at its core. So, in practice, what did the transition look like in Libya? We've got a little timeline here, which I'll kind of walk you through. I do remind that this is the INGO perspective. INGOs first learned of official transition plans about midway through 2022, with sector deactivation taking place within the last quarter of the year. The deactivation process started 3 months before the humanitarian architecture was set to dismantle. Before I go on, I want to underscore and bold and 24 font, if I could, this is not a criticism of those tasked with managing the dismantling process, whose hard work through a daunting process with limited resources is recognized tremendously by the forum, by the INGO community. Neither is it intended to undermine the work that went in prior to INGOs being plugged in to the plans. This is an effort to show that the resources provided must be sufficient enough to allow country teams to transition as closely as possible in line with the global guidance, doing so responsibly in ways that don't regress on the progress made to date and don't put those who we exist to serve at even more risk. So in March of 2022, INGOs were invited to share feedback on these two collective outcomes. 1, migration management, and 2, durable solutions for IDPs. But this came without explicit reference to the fact that the architecture was expected to shift suddenly. INGO shared feedback, largely linked to usage of the term migration management alone, that neither collective outcome mentioned any sort of safe pathways outside of Libya when it comes to migration or migrants, protection issues linked to communities who fall outside of Libyan legal frameworks, i.e. migrants, refugees, IDPs, how the UN's network on migration would work in parallel with the migration management collective outcome, and most importantly, that the collective outcomes assumptions were predicated on arguably the most important piece that was missing. 1, a unified government, and 2, a government with an appetite to engage on such sensitive topics. A month later, April, INGOs were invited to an online consultation on the drafting of the Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, something that I'll refer to as the UN SDCF from here on forward, just to save me those words. The UNSDCF was built on 4 pillars and included the 2 collective outcomes. This was also the first time members, or INGOs, saw various transition-related documents, including a common country analysis and a Libya peer-to-peer mission report. At this stage, it still wasn't made explicitly clear that this was the replacement architecture that was expected to follow. From our perspective, now, a significant shift in the humanitarian architecture was happening, one that was having immense consequences on the overall response. But when INGOs asked how this process, this development cooperation framework, fit within the future of the HRP and the future of the HNO, the answer we received was simply that the HRP is an OCHA-driven process, whereas the cooperation framework is a development-focused process. This seemed very much siloed, left INGOs a little bit confused. As part of the feedback, INGOs requested information regarding end goals of the consultation process, timelines, next steps, what informed the 4 strategic priorities, rationale for not holding consultations within a wider forum more inclusive of the broader diversity of response actors, and cautioned against a top-down, UN-driven approach that risked overlooking the diversity of response actors on the ground. May witnessed a visit from OCHA headquarters to discuss the potential dismantling and to make determinations around the size and composition of the future of the response. At this stage, INGOs began to see significant reductions in OCHA staff that continue to increase exponentially throughout the year. August, an official blueprint of what the new development architecture would look like was delivered. This went through multiple rounds of feedback. It also coincided with an uptick in clashes in one part of the country. INGO feedback largely focused on contingency measures in case of a resurgence in conflict, response capacity to residual humanitarian needs, especially in the absence of a unified government, and more than anything, considering the protection crisis in country, ensuring a meaningful and responsible approach to the centrality of protection. September came, official notice that deactivation would take place for all sectors in Libya by end of year was issued. INGO feedback at this stage recognized the tremendous efforts and achievement in finalizing the cooperation framework, leadership of the HCRC, inclusion of language around centrality of protection integrated throughout the cooperation framework. But we still had serious concerns, and they included timelines, hasty dismantling of the sectors, who the sectors were being handed over to, lack of centralized technical protection expertise was still missing from the blueprints, one capable of taking on the core functions of the protection sector, especially in a context like Libya. More importantly, given the sensitivity of protection issues and the ongoing violations, who the sector was being handed over to, which technical line ministry, which government counterpart. INGO endorsement, this became such an issue that INGO endorsement was contingent on that. So by end of November, sectors were informed that the cluster deactivation would be finalized by end of year, something we'll talk about a little bit later. And by end of year, thanks to strong and joint coordinated advocacy between the INGO Forum and the protection sector, it was agreed that a transitional protection working group would be maintained, but only till end of this month, literally, due to limited resources. So in conclusion, without discounting the immense amount of work that went into the lead up, the INGO perspective is that Libya's process shifted quite suddenly within the span of less than a year. INGOs understand competing humanitarian crises globally. We understand the limited and, as mentioned earlier, record level humanitarian budgets. We do have a shared responsibility, however, to ensure that the broader systems and global structures adequately and responsibly support those tasked with dismantling and handing over. If done well, as we saw from our Nexus discussion earlier, the transition should be an organic process born from coherent, joined-up approaches. Contexts evolve slowly in non-linear ways. We know this. HDP transition should be informed by those critical context analyses, aligning the policy as closely as humanly possible to the country context, as opposed to contorting the context to fit within the policy framework, which is what appeared to be happening in Libya. I will now pass it over to Jacqueline, and who will walk us through the transition process in Iraq.
Thank you so much. I want to reiterate what Iman has said in that the information and that is contained in this discussion, it is not a criticism. We recognize that it's always easy to look back and try to learn lessons from what has already taken place. Whereas when we're in the middle of something, we're in the thick of things, and that it can be incredibly difficult and complex. So, similar to Libya, I want to ensure that Iraq recognizes the hard work, the amount of time that has been put into looking at a transition phase in Iraq, and moving away from humanitarian assistance through the Nexus process and then to the development part of assistance within the country. So with that said, the questions really are, was Iraq ready for a transition? Is it ready now? What were some of the transition planning modalities in place, and what were perhaps some of the missed opportunities that could have taken place? Just briefly, according to USAID report in February of 2023, referencing other data collection from IOM, UNHCR, and other sources, as of March 2022, there are 2.5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance within Iraq. There are 961,000 people in acute need. There are 1.2 million estimated number of people internally displaced within Iraq. There are 691,000 number of IDPs residing in camps. And Iraq still hosts over 500,000 Syrian refugees as well, almost exclusively within the Kurdistan region in the northern part of the country. The living conditions of Iraq's returnee population, so of approximately 5 million IDPs who have returned to the areas of origin or other locations within Iraq since March of 2014, nearly 12% reside in locations where they face severe living conditions characterized by a lack of basic services, a lack of livelihood opportunities, ongoing insecurity, and perceived issues of safety and social cohesion. And this is according to an IOM assessment that was conducted through July and September of last year. The number of returnees reporting poor or severe living conditions during that period increased, not decreased, but increased by nearly 17,500 people compared to January and March timeframe when IOM conducted a similar type of assessment. The majority of IDPs sheltering in the 26 remaining formal camps across Iraq's Dohuk, Erbil, Nineveh, and Solania governorates, which is predominantly in the northern part of the country. Nineveh, for those of you who are not familiar, is part of federal Iraq, whereas Dohuk, Erbil, and Solania are part of the Kurdistan regional government. Similar to Libya, Iraq also has two governments, which further complicates the situation within the country. So of those residing in the formal camps, approximately 98% stated that they do not intend to return to their area of origin. And this was between the time period of July 2022 and July 2023. However, approximately 58% of those who were involved in that survey indicated that at some point that they would like to return. What that point in time is, we don't know. When that might be, we don't know. Will they go back to specifically areas of origin or other locations within Iraq? We certainly don't know. Another challenge in terms of deciding whether or not Iraq was really ready for a transition is that, as previously mentioned, communities in Iraq lack access to basic services, and this is directly linked in part to civil documentation issues. Most services within Iraq, such as education, health, and shelter support, are fundamentally predicated upon the possession of civil documentation. This is often a difficult process, a legal process, if someone is missing their legal documents. So according to a report by IRC in 2022, nearly 85% of households assessed that they reported difficulties in accessing basic services, with many citing high cost as the main barrier to being engaged in the legal process in order to obtain the necessary civil documentation. And moreover, nearly 15% of those households reported at least one member of that family missing or in need of their civil documents. One of the things that just happened most recently, and that was in December of 2022, is that the Iraq's Minister of Education announced the planned closure of all schools established in for IDPs in the Kurdistan region will be closed by June of 2023. The impact of this decision by the government in Baghdad is yet to play out. However, one can assume that this will lead to a number of children not going to school and dropping out. Some children may be forced or feel that they have to return to an area of origin in order to access education. Returning to an area of origin may lead to further complications in that whether or not those locations are secure, whether they feel safe, whether or not there's adequate transportation, social cohesion issues. So the next several months, as this starts to play out, will be very important from a protection issue for Iraq's children. So moving on in that whether or not Iraq was actually prepared, it has been reported that one of the key decisions, or I should say, one of the key points in making decision on whether or not to transition Iraq was the decreasing humanitarian funding, and that this was the key driver behind the decision to exit. And this is despite global policy. In addition, and this kind of ties back into what Iman was saying with respect to Libya, in that the numbers and the methodology used to calculate numbers of IDPs, number of people in need, what those areas of needs are, has changed in Iraq. This does not allow the humanitarian community, the development community, donors, to actually have the ability to do a proper assessment of what is needed, how many people are in need, and what kind of dollar amount needs to be attached to further providing humanitarian assistance. Similar to Libya, the OCHA country office downsized rapidly, creating panic and a vacuum in leadership and coordination capacity. Critical functions and staff positions were vacant for months at a time when they should have been reinforced. The departure of the OCHA head of office in July 2022, followed by the departure of the then HC 2 months later, was particularly destabilizing, as both had conceptualized what a transition period or a transition should look like. The data does show that the funding dropped from about $1.9 billion in 2016 to $335 million in 2022. Donors also indicated that there will be further decreases in funding for 2023. So the HC's reliance upon that key factor, although it should not be the sole key factor or the main key factor in deciding to transition, there's definitely truth in the fact that funding is decreasing significantly, but at the same time, there is still significant humanitarian need within Iraq. Also during this time period in Iraq, the HCT adopted a narrower, more prioritized definition of humanitarian need, which resulted in the reduction of the number of people in need that is reported. Now, like I said, this is based on the methodology used to calculate the numbers. So there's not, from the NGO perspective, an adequate representation of those in need and what types of needs currently exist. With a significant reduction in OCHA staff, clusters have reported that there was, during 2022, that there was no real entity who was overseeing the day-to-day process to bring together and inform clusters, generate options, build consensus, and engage the national authorities. So this led to some of the clusters, either in whole or in part, to fill in some of those gaps themselves during a very politically turbulent time. As many of you may know, that there was an outbreak in protest in Iraq last year. which led to the shutdown of the government in Baghdad for a significant period of time. Let's see. Also, during this time period, the HCT summaries do indicate that the NGO world, that we did request for a cluster risk assessment and analysis to pinpoint the consequences of a potential exit on beneficiaries. The analysis was essentially prepared by the ICCG, but it has been viewed that this is more of a paper exercise as opposed to a real in-depth analysis. It has been reported that the UN staff does not necessarily disagree with the concerns of the NGO world. And anecdotally, even donors who were initially on board with the transition and deactivation of the clusters had second thoughts as the political situation in 2022 became increasingly more complicated. Another factor leading to the transition was the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. As everyone here knows, the international humanitarian system has been stretched already. And then there was a push reportedly by some donors who no longer were interested in supporting what was perceived as a middle income country like Iraq with the humanitarian assistance through funding, when they now are facing a war on their own country, on their own continent in Europe itself. And that some donors, it was their desire for the Iraq operation to downsize and to downsize quickly. The outbreak of the war in Ukraine also emphasized the fact that Iraq emerged as a major oil producer and exporter, increasing the government's revenue to a high of more than $11 billion per month due to a spike in the global energy prices. The lack of funding for transition activities and plans was cited as a concern by clusters as early as January 2022. No funding was earmarked for the transition, and by all accounts, the lack of dedicated funding for the transition was an impediment to the process and a key learning that we should take forward for other transitioning contexts. By all accounts, some individual clusters did report, as Iman previously mentioned, in that the global guidance is that before a transition and deactivation should take place, there should be in place transition plans that start right after the activation of clusters is put into place. This did not happen in Iraq, and which led to some individual clusters reporting that they did at times, from various points in times, have some transition planning in place, and then that there were also attempts in 2020 and again in 2021 to start having preliminary discussions across all clusters. However, a response-wide transitioning plan did not start until December 2021, following a decision by the HC and the HCT donor contact group to either hand over the assistance and the ability or the implementation of humanitarian assistance to government, or simply exit most components of the joint response by 31 December 2022. There were no cluster transition plans in place or maintained at the beginning of 2022, and it has been reported that the process became fragmented and siloed over time, and that by summertime of 2022, just last year, everything seemed to be off track and that no one was really leading the transition phase forward.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So we thought it might be helpful, before I talk a little bit about what the cluster deactivation process looked like in Libya, to just look at the guidance. We did a little stock take of OCHA guidance, IASC policy, and this is kind of our list of what we should keep in mind during transitions before we decide to deactivate. IASC policy makes clear that plans to deactivate and transition clusters should be prepared as soon as possible after activation, and that the HC or HCT should carry out an annual coordination review to assess whether clusters should continue as they are, be expanded, streamlined, or transition with a plan and benchmark for deactivation. We know that coordination reviews globally have an approximate 30% completion rate, but in 2022 in Libya anyway, did not happen. IASC's reference module for cluster coordination also makes clear that cluster deactivation may be considered when at least one of the conditions that led to its activation is no longer present. One, the humanitarian situation improves, significantly reducing needs and associated response and coordination gaps. Or two, that national structures acquire sufficient capacity to coordinate and meet residual humanitarian needs. They are initiated and led by the Humanitarian Coordinator, HC, in consultation with the country team, wherever possible in close collaboration with national authorities, supported by OCHA. Lead agencies, cluster partners, and national counterparts should also be involved in transition deactivation plans. They are based on an assessment of national capacity, including the present structure and resources of relevant response and coordination mechanisms. Not all clusters must be deactivated at the same time. The timing of deactivation is related to ongoing needs and the presence or absence of national structures competent to manage the functions in question. They take account the context, including the scale of residual or continued needs, the ability of successor mechanisms to respond in line with humanitarian principles. They are guided by early recovery and resilience building objectives, including steps to build national and local capacity. Where feasible, clusters should share leadership with national actors and work with national counterparts to build their capacity to assume coordination roles in humanitarian preparedness and response. Care should be taken to avoid transferring leadership before capacity is in place. During a transition process, the line of accountability for core cluster functions and responsibilities must be clearly articulated. While a cluster is formally activated, accountability remains with the lead agency. Transition plans should outline how accountabilities will shift to government or to other coordination mechanisms. Jacqueline, I think you went through this already, right? Should I skip over?
There were a couple. Yeah, there are a couple things if we could just jump to the next slide instead of this one. And then there are just a couple key things I want to highlight regarding the cluster deactivation process that took place. So for the cluster deactivation, the HC developed a transition options paper in Iraq in mid-2022. One of the challenges with the options paper is it outlined 6 different potential ways in which to deactivate clusters. One, starting with no HRP for 2022, all the way through option 6 being a bit of a mix between an HRP and a development kind of approach to the deactivation and the next phase within Iraq. The HCT voted for option 1 for Iraq, which was to have no HRP in 2023. Interestingly, though, at the following HCT, OCHA presented an in-depth overview for option 1, despite a prior vote, and promised that at the following HCT in September of 2022, an in-depth overview for option 6 would be provided. That overview never took place, and at the September 2022 HCT is when the prior HC made her farewell presentation to the HCT, highlighting some of the key successes during her tenure in Iraq. Once a new HCRC was in place later in 2022, there was a humanitarian transition strategy that was shared and provided the opportunity for feedback. The challenges with the initial, what was phrased at the time, a humanitarian transition strategy, was that it was not shared in multiple languages, which has been an ongoing concern throughout the provision of services in Iraq by the humanitarian architecture, in that NCCI, we emphasize and stress and fight to have all documents that we send out and that we send out on behalf of other lead agencies in both English and in Arabic at the minimum. The humanitarian transition strategy was eventually reviewed, and it was determined that it was really not a strategy. It did not have benchmarks. It did not have timelines. There was a complete dearth of discussion on localization. And then it was eventually then changed into what is now known as the Humanitarian Transition Overview. It remains in place that the NGO community in Iraq still has significant concerns over this humanitarian transition overview, and that specifically civil society is not fully incorporated, and there still seems to be a lack of consideration for localization and the importance that the concept of localization should play and needs to play within Iraq. Some of the government concerns or challenges. Sorry, Iman, I'm going to come back to you. I'm sorry about that. I was just kind of skipping ahead. So I'll go turn it back over to Iman so that she can discuss the cluster deactivation in Libya. Only to say that as of December 31st, 2022, the clusters were fully deactivated. The HC did submit a letter to the EDG in August of 2022 to request the deactivation. Some of the clusters within the UN architecture had no idea that the clusters were being deactivated until that letter was made public. The NGO community did push back. It's not that we did not recognize that the deactivation would take place. It was the manner in which it was taking place, and that there was a lack of cohesion, a lack of coherence, a lack of collaboration amongst all sectors who are operating in Iraq to support the Iraqi people. So I will now then turn it back over to Iman as promised.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And really quickly, the cluster deactivation process in Libya, like I mentioned, really unfolded in the span of about 3 months. I will underscore again that INGOs do appreciate the hard work by all those who led this daunting process with very limited resources. But basically, September 22, deactivation was announced formally through an ISCG meeting. This took place 1 day before the departure of OCHA's head of office in Libya. Concerns were raised about lack of support, the seemingly hurried timeline, lack of meaningful consultation on the deactivation plans, and at minimum ensuring that IAS guidelines are adhered to. The protection sector was extremely concerned about the lack of centralized protection expertise and lines of clear accountability under the proposed blueprints, specifically who or which line ministry protection was being handed over to. As mentioned earlier, we scaled up the advocacy alongside the sector through a number of different routes. We proposed a set of recommendations that essentially revolved around ensuring responsible evidence-based decision-making, particularly given the lack of identifiable government counterpart, deteriorating humanitarian space, and which at this point continues to shrink exponentially in Libya, ensuring flexible and realistic deactivation timelines, ensuring decisions account for national level capacities and limitations, urging for a responsible approach that included maintenance of a protection working group of some sort. In the end, it was agreed that a transitional working group would be included in the new structure until end of March of this year. Protection risks have and are forecasted to continue having a remarkable impact on Libyans and non-Libyan communities alike in Libya, especially as access constraints in country continue to increase as we speak. They hinder both the quality and the level of the response. The Global Protection Cluster makes very clear that protection should be given special consideration during transition. So the dedicated Transitional Protection Working Group is now set to expire at the end of March, at which point it's still unclear who the core protection responsibilities will be handed over to. Based on a survey of 22 protection partners, including UN as well as INGO agencies, protection experts conducted just a few weeks ago, the vast majority did not believe that technical analysis to clearly capture, flag, monitor, and respond to protection risks exists in the new structure should the transitional working group dismantle as planned. Overwhelmingly, almost 90% of the respondents believe a technical working group within the HDP Nexus Advisory Group, which is the HCT 2.0 in Libya, must be maintained to centralize protection-specific expertise, ensure the centrality of protection is meaningfully and responsibly operationalized as mandated by the global guidance and the Global Protection Cluster. When we talk about government capacities, which is something that the guidance warns about, there's a growing body of research. We know that there is no formal instruction on how protection should fit within development structures per se. The UN Secretary General, though, makes clear that while working towards collective outcomes, vulnerability and risk need to be the rule. We must recognize the existence of contexts that require the delivery of urgent and life-saving assistance and protection in the short term. The political status quo in Libya remains, with two competing governments, insufficient local capacities, and a shrinking civic and humanitarian space. While indeed the language of protection exists in the cooperation framework and across the various TORs of the various working groups and collective outcomes, the lines of accountability in the absence of a protection-specific working group remain unclear. 100% of the survey respondents that I referred to earlier confirmed that deactivation guidelines failed to be met in Libya. Many elaborated that those expected to bear the duty of care are linked to the alleged perpetrators, and that national structures evidently lack the willingness, capacity, and sufficient legal frameworks. When respondents were asked to rate the capacity of authorities' ability to work effectively with the cooperation framework actors to either lead, be supported, or advised on either of the two collective outcomes as they pertain to migrants, refugees, or IDPs, the average rating was just under 3 on a scale from 1 to 10. Almost 100% of the respondents were not able to identify a trustworthy and reliable counterpart in country with whom they believe protection issues should be handed over to. Many elaborated to highlight the continued political stalemate, fragmentation of the government, and the widely documented increase in scrutiny faced by response actors supporting these communities. And Jacqueline, over to you to talk about national capacities in Iraq.
Great, thank you so much. As per the handover arrangements included in the HC's letter to the EDG requesting cluster deactivation, cluster functions were supposed to be assumed by durable solutions, government or co-led government, the sectoral groups, the CLAs themselves, or phased out entirely. As of reporting in November of last year, only 25% of clusters stated that their handover counterparts in government fully accepted the cluster transition plans and the transfer of critical cluster functions to them. And those who accepted the responsibilities did not necessarily agree with the time frame that was being imposed upon them. Another critical concern with government capacity is whether or not government has the political will, the technical expertise, and to actually pick up where the humanitarian architecture has been providing assistance to the Iraqi people. The question is whether or not the government will actually follow through and whether or not they even have the technical expertise to do so. There's also a question surrounding because under Iraq's constitution, it is mandated that certain ministries be decentralized, which means that the responsibilities lie within the governor's office within each governorate. So the agreements that may or may not be reached at the federal level may or may not be carried out at the governorate level. So in the interest of time, I am going to turn it back over to Iman to discuss needs and narratives in Libya.
Sure, and I'm conscious of time. We have about 6 minutes, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions for anyone online or in the room. Are you okay if we skip the next section and jump to our broader recommendations? I mean, we could talk about this forever, but is that okay with you, John?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. I think that for me, I'm happy to provide a list of different recommendations and lessons learned from Iraq to anyone who's interested. I think for me, like the broader recommendations, I think one of the key points I would really like to highlight is that if there is going to be an effective transition, regardless of the context, regardless of how complicated the context is, all the different actors who are supporting the humanitarian architecture and supporting the people within that country need to be involved from the beginning, and not after a plan, a process, a document, a strategy has already been devised and developed by one organization. And I'm referring to specifically civil society because the donors, the humanitarian architecture, they look to civil society to carry out these key important projects, programs, and support not only the people, but also support government. However, they're not part of the conversation from the very beginning. So I think that for me, on behalf of Iraq, I strongly recommend that there be a inclusive process in multiple languages so that our national partners can be fully engaged, take place. And then in terms of our broader recommendations, we also have that it is critically important that there should be adherence to the global guidance, ensuring that it is fit for country-specific context. The rules were devised, these guidelines were devised, and policies were devised to help us do a better job. And if those who are responsible are not following these guidelines, then it only sets the foundation for potential failure or for not fulfilling the best promises or the best potential that we have in order to help the people who are in need. I think that it's incredibly important that we move beyond rhetoric. It's one thing for all of us to discuss, talk about, write about, argue about what could have been done, should have been done, needs to be done. We need to get past that because we all have a shared responsibility to ensure that any coordination, any information sharing, any planning, implementation needs to be meaningful. There needs to be, as the saying goes, meat on the bones, that it's not just words. There has to be significant action to support the words and the plans and the strategies that we all come up with. And finally, the other broader recommendation is that funding and finance considerations, there has to be flexible, multi-year, fit-for-purpose funding models for all response actors. And that simply the belief that Iraq, for example, because it does have significant funding through oil exports and its reliance on the petroleum industry, that it can fully take on all of the functions that humanitarian architecture has been providing. Arguably, yes. However, there are other considerations in place in Iraq in terms of like this decentralization, the fact that there was only a caretaker government for a year. But putting all of that aside, there has to be better planning from a funding and finance consideration. And I will argue on behalf of Iraq, and Iman, you are free to agree with me or not, in that there has to be significant funding for NGO4. All of you come to us for information. You come to us for assistance, for guidance, for helping to solve problems for your other implementing partners. If NGO fora around the world are not sufficiently funded with unrestricted funding, we will cease to exist and we will not be able to do the very important job that you need us to do. So with that, I will turn it back over to my colleague.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for that. In the interest of time, I will thank everybody online for joining and everybody in the room for joining as well. And turn it over to you guys. I'm sure you've had enough of us speaking. So questions, comments, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Myrna from DRC, and I was asked by some of our colleagues in Iraq to pose a question on your thoughts, particularly in Iraq, but I think it pertains to Libya as well, as in the transition process, when it comes down to negotiating for humanitarian activities, which humanitarian needs are still existing, how do you propose navigating the use of humanitarian principles in those negotiations, considering that the humanitarian architecture has been dismantled?
It's a very fair question. Iman, I see that you have something you want to say, so if you would like to kick off that part of the conversation.
No, please go ahead, Jacqueline.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important question, and I think that there is a lot of advocacy work that needs to take place in Iraq in terms of how assistance needs to be provided, should be provided. Part of the challenge is that in Iraq, to be quite frank, the humanitarian actors or I should say the humanitarian architecture and the development architecture do not seem to want to fill the gap between a purely humanitarian setting and one that is a purely development setting. And to me, this belies the key fundamental humanitarian principle of do no harm. In that, regardless if it's an articulated humanitarian principle, or if you are working on the development side and supporting the more traditional development form of assistance within a country, the principle of do no harm does not know boundaries in terms of like where its funding sources are, what line, what description it falls under, whether it's humanitarian development, security sector, peace building, whatever that might be. And it seems to me that this is one of the key principles that needs to be relied upon. The challenge that Iraq has faced and that we're trying to find ways to solve it is bringing together the humanitarian donors and government together in the same room with the development side donors, in addition to civil society, to have robust conversations about what are the challenges, what are the needs, what needs to take place. And similar to what I was just saying before, in that we have to get beyond the rhetoric, in that you can get all these people in the same room and everyone agrees that something needs to be done. But so far, it just seems to be, important discussions that are taking place. It would be really good to see some active, hard, concrete steps put into place. So it's an incredibly difficult conversation, and it's going to take, I think it will take more conversation, but at the same time, there are people in the position to make decisions. They need to start making decisions and coming together to support this gap, this nexus, this core kind of phase in the transition that does not fall uniquely under humanitarian and does not fall uniquely under development as well. I'm not sure if that helps or not, but I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Anybody else? Questions, comments?
Yeah, hi. My name is Dax Roque. I'm the country director for NRC in Libya. I guess my question is to you, Jacqueline, and thank you for the presentation. One of the key challenges for us was maintaining protection as central to any sort of coordination architecture that comes after or during the transition. So how have you tackled that in Iraq? If you can maybe highlight some successes and maybe some areas of improvement. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for the question. I will say this, to the credit of the HC and the HCT, protection remains a high priority. And even though the cluster is being deactivated, what has been put in place is a new protection and essentially human rights platform. And it's in its nascent stages, in that we just recently held elections so that it could be co-chaired and that there can be representation not only by our national partners on this very critical platform, but also by our foreign-based NGO partners as well. So with that platform, and it is not only focused on what we traditionally think of protection issues, but it also is open to other issues that may fall under a human rights kind of category outside of the traditionally defined category of protection under the humanitarian architecture. So with this platform, it is an advocacy platform. It is a platform for organizations to be able to come together, report potential abuses, and to seek guidance and assistance. We have a set of TORs for that platform as well. And if anyone's interested, we're happy to share that with the broader community. So if that helps you to establish a similar platform or a similar type of mechanism in Libya, for example, we're happy to do that.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I think we certainly would be keen, yes, because our working group, like I said, ends at the end of this month.
Sure, happy to.
Any other questions? And I'm getting the time is up signal. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Jacqueline, and everyone at NCCI. Thank you to the Libya INGO Forum. Thank you to DG ECHO.
Thank you, everyone.